Hey, everybody, and welcome to Deep Dive Podcast, Ukraine, the strategic view. I'm Robert, and I'm super excited to be jumping into this topic with all of you today.
I'm Linda here to help us break it all down.
All right, Linda. So we're taking a deep dive today into all the ripple effects of the war in Ukraine, specifically how it's hitting the European Union, all the economic fallout, the public sentiment. It's really a whirlwind over there. What's the thing that's jumped out at you the most from all the research and articles that you've been looking at?
Yeah, Robert, what really stands out to me is this growing fatigue across the EU. We saw that initial outpouring of support for Ukraine countries, opening their borders, taking in refugees, imposing all those sanctions on Russia.
Right.
And now it seems like that wave is kind of cresting and there's this sense of weariness setting in.
Yeah, I can definitely understand that a war that drags on for this long, especially one that's, so close to home, has got to have a pretty big effect on people's lives and how they view everything.
Absolutely. And it's playing out in some big ways. First, think about the economic impacts of all those sanctions against Russia. I mean, they were designed to put pressure on Russia, of course.
Right.
But they've also had kind of a blowback effect on the EU economy.
Yeah, it's almost like a boomerang.
Right, exactly.
You throw it with all the best intentions.
Yeah.
But then it swings back and hits, So how is this actually playing out? Give us a real world example of this economic strain.
Okay, well, let's look at energy. Germany was super reliant on Russia for oil and gas.
Right.
And now with the sanctions, they're scrambling to find new sources, and it's not easy.
Yeah.
A perfect example of this is this PCK oil refinery in Schwedt.
Oh, yeah, I read about that. The refinery is facing some massive job losses because they don't have that Russian oil coming in anymore.
Exactly. It's a harsh reminder that sanctions have a human cost. The German government is trying to find other oil suppliers. And they talk about switching to renewables like hydrogen, but that takes time. Meanwhile, those workers in Schwedt are facing unemployment. Their livelihoods are just hanging in the balance.
Yeah, it really makes you think about whether those long-term goals were given enough thought when the sanctions were slapped on in the first place.
Yeah.
But you mentioned earlier, Linda, that the economic impact is just one side of the coin of all this fatigue. What's the other side?
Well, the other side, Robert, is the social impact. At first we saw this incredible show of unity all across the EU countries, welcoming Ukrainians with open arms. As this conflict keeps dragging on, people are starting to feel the pressure. Resources are stretched thin, and people are beginning to ask, how long can we really keep this level of support up?
And it's not just some abstract concern, is it? It's showing up in the political world.
Right. You can see it happening in Poland. For example, presidential candidates like Rafał Trzaskowski are talking about putting limits on social benefits for Ukrainian refugees.
Wow.
He's saying that only those who work and pay taxes in Poland should get the full benefit. Now, that might sound tough to some, but it reflects this rising anxiety over resources and what it takes to integrate a large refugee population over the long haul.
It's a tough balancing act, isn't it? You're providing help to people who desperately need it, while also making sure that your own citizens are taken care of.
Yeah.
And it's definitely a breeding ground for political maneuvering.
For sure. Another Polish presidential candidate, Karol Nawrocki, is tapping right into this. He's going hard on Polish sovereignty and decision-making about Ukraine.
Okay.
He's appealing to voters who feel like their own needs are getting overshadowed by all the focus on Ukraine.
So, Linda, we're seeing this fatigue play out in the economic realm and in the social realm. Germany wrestling with how dependent they are on other countries for energy. Poland trying to navigate this whole refugee situation. And then this rise of nationalism popping up all over the EU.
You got it. It's this multi-layered problem. And it makes you wonder, is the EU's strategy really sustainable in the long run?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
Yeah.
We've laid out how complex the current situation is. All the fatigue, the economic strain, all the political stuff. Now, I want to kind of zoom out a little bit.
Yeah.
Look at what all this means strategically. Where do we go from here, Linda?
Well, to answer that, Robert, we need to step back and look at the big picture. What's Russia really trying to achieve in the long run? What about the EU? What are their goals? And are the things they're doing right now actually getting them closer to those goals or further away?
Okay, listeners, buckle up. Things are about to get really interesting. We're zooming out to look at the whole strategic chessboard of this whole conflict. Stay with us.
So welcome back to our deep dive into the strategic view of this war in Ukraine. Before we jumped into the long-term strategies, Robert, we were talking about that PCK oil refinery in Schwedt. I think it's a great example of the tough spot that the EU is in.
For sure, Linda. It's like a miniature version of the bigger issues.
Right.
You've got those workers facing unemployment because the Russian oil stopped coming in.
Yeah.
It's an in-your-face reminder that these sanctions hurt. They're aimed at Russia, But they have real consequences for people in the EU, too.
Exactly. And it's not just about finding other places to get oil from, which is hard enough.
Right.
It's about how fast they can switch over to different energy sources.
Mm-hmm.
Germany, like a lot of EU countries, trying to go green, with things like hydrogen.
Mm-hmm.
But that takes time. You need infrastructure investment. It doesn't happen overnight.
And while that's all happening, the workers in Schwedt are sitting there thinking, what about us? It makes you wonder if the people who came up with these sanctions really understood how far the effects would go.
Right.
The human cost.
Yeah, it definitely raises some questions. And it shows how complicated this whole thing is. We can't think of the EU as just one big blob. Each country has its own problems, its own economic situation.
Yeah.
What one country sees as a necessary sacrifice could be a disaster for another.
Right. And that feeds into the fatigue we were talking about earlier. If some countries feel like they're carrying more than their fair share while others benefit, it could really strain that whole idea of a united Europe.
Exactly. And that's where things get really interesting when you're talking about strategy, because it seems like one of Russia's goals is to take advantage of those cracks, to weaken the EU, to break up NATO.
Right.
A divided Europe is a weaker Europe. It can't stand up to Russia as effectively.
It's like they're playing chess, isn't it?
It is.
Each side is making moves, trying to figure out what the other one's going to do next, looking for weaknesses to exploit.
That's a great way to put it, Robert. And in this game, how the public feels is a big part of it. Russia can use that growing fatigue, the economic worries, the rise of nationalism to stir up trouble within the EU. And that could make the West less likely to support Ukraine.
So if we're talking long-term strategies, is this whole thing with sanctions really working? Is it actually the best way to go? Or could it backfire and put Europe in an even worse spot?
That's the big question, Robert.
Right.
And there's no easy answer. Sanctions are a blunt tool. They can cause pain, but whether they actually change anything is up for debate.
What about Russia? What's their end game? What are they trying to get out of all of this?
Well, it's a mixed bag. Some people say it's about grabbing land, bringing back Russia's old sphere of influence. Others think it's about making sure Putin stays in power. It could be both. But one thing's for sure, Russia is playing the long game. They're ready for this to go on for a while.
It's a pretty bleak picture, Linda. Is there any light at the end of the tunnel? Any way this ends without years of suffering and chaos?
That's the question we all want an answer to, Robert. And it's a question we're going to dig into more in our next segment, because even with all this going on, all the fatigue and the fear, there are still signs of hope, possible paths to peace.
And we're back for the final part of our deep dive into the war in Ukraine and all the strategic stuff surrounding it. Linda, we've really dug into a lot, haven't we?
We have, Robert.
From that growing feeling of being worn out by it all, to how the sanctions are affecting economies, and even how this conflict could split Europe right down the middle. It's heady stuff.
It is. It's been fascinating to see how that initial surge of support across the EU is being challenged by the fact that this war just keeps going. The economy, the anxieties in society, all the political back and forth, it all adds up to a very complicated situation.
And for our listeners out there, I think it's important to bring it back to you guys. What's standing out to you? What are the big things that you're thinking about now that we've gone through all this?
Robert, think about those workers in Schwedt. They're about to lose their jobs because of the sanctions on Russian oil.
Right.
Their situation really shows the tough decisions that European leaders have to make.
Yeah.
How do you help Ukraine, but also protect your own people from economic hardship?
It's a real tickle, isn't it, Linda?
It is.
And it shows that there are no easy answers here.
Yeah.
Every decision has consequences.
Absolutely. And that's why it's so important to think strategically, to look past the crisis that's right in front of us and consider what happens down the line.
So let's talk about those long-term implications, Linda. We've painted a pretty gloomy picture so far.
Yeah.
Is there any hope for a solution to this war? Is there any path to peace?
Well, Robert, like I said before, there are some glimmers of hope. Even when there's fighting going on, dialogue and diplomacy are still important tools.
So you're saying even though things are super tense right now, we shouldn't completely rule out a negotiated settlement?
Exactly. History has shown us again and again that conflicts, no matter how stuck they seem, can be solved by talking. It's never too late to start talking, to find some common ground, to build bridges instead of walls.
That sounds good in theory, but it also seems really tough to pull off given how much distrust and bad blood there is between everyone involved.
It's a challenge for sure, but it starts with realizing that there are no easy answers here. There aren't clear-cut good guys and bad guys in this situation. Everyone has their own worries and reasons for feeling the way they do.
So you're saying we need to approach this with empathy, with a willingness to try and understand each other's point of view, even if we don't agree with it?
Exactly. It's about finding ways to lower the temperature, to shift from fighting to cooperating.
Linda, this has been a really eye-opening conversation. You've helped us break down all the complicated parts of this conflict and shown the strategic challenges that the EU is facing. But I think what sticks with me the most is that even when things look really bad, there's always hope for peace.
I agree, Robert. It's important to hold on to that hope, to keep looking for ways to bridge the gaps and build a more peaceful future for everyone.
And to everyone listening, we want to leave you with this thought. As you keep up with everything that's going on in Ukraine, remember to look past the headlines. Think about all the different viewpoints, the complicated reasons why people do things, the human stories behind it all.
And most importantly, don't give up hope. There's always a chance for peace, even when things are really tough.
Well said, Linda. Thanks for joining me on this deep dive. It's been great exploring this complex topic with you.
Thanks for having me, Robert.
I'm Robert, and this has been the Deep Dive Podcast. Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep trying to understand.
And to our listeners, goodbye for now.